All right, let's talk about Sega. This is a story that has everything. I mean, you've got them ruling the arcades, taking on the biggest names in the business. It's an epic tale of incredible innovation, some of the most intense rivalries you can imagine, and, well, some truly legendary mistakes in video game history.
You know, it's that classic underdog story, right? David versus Goliath. But with this heartbreaking twist. Sega went right after the king, and for a little while there, it seriously looked like they were going to pull it off. But then, their whole hardware empire just came crashing down.
And that's the big question that's always gotten to me. Seriously, how does a company that was literally on top of the world, a brand that was the absolute definition of cool, just vanish from the console business? It's wild. So let's try and figure out what actually happened.
So to really get a grip on the fall, we got to go back to the beginning, to the rise. Because Sega didn't start in your living room. Oh no, they started with all those flashing lights and the sound of quarters dropping into coin slots. We're talking about the arcade. It all kicks off way back in 1960. And get this, it wasn't even with video games. They were importing coin-out machines, and their name was service games. Yeah, that's where Sega comes from. Anyway, from there they just dominated the arcades with crazy addictive hits like Frogger. It was kind of inevitable, right? They had to try and bring that magic home, which they did, first with the SG-1000, and then with their first real shot at the title, the Master System.
And you know what? The Master System did pretty darn well for itself. We're talking around 13 million units sold. It was a massive hit in places like Europe and Brazil, but in the US market, the one that really mattered, Nintendo was just this unstoppable juggernaut. So this first fight, it really set the stage for one of the most epic rivalries gaming has ever, and I mean ever, seen.
Okay, so after that first round with the Master System, Sega realized something crucial. They couldn't just compete with Nintendo. No, they had to completely change the game. And boy, did they.
This was the game changer. The Sega Genesis. Or, if you were elsewhere in the world, the Mega Drive. It landed in North America in 1989, and its 16-bit processor was an absolute beast. It delivered these fast, slick, arcade-perfect experiences that Nintendo's hardware just couldn't touch at the time.
And their marketing? Oh, man, this slogan just says it all. It was so aggressive, so edgy. They went right for the teenagers who were starting to think Nintendo was, for little kids. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. That wasn't just some catchy phrase. It was a straight-up declaration of war. Sega was the cool kid on the block.
But you can't be the cool kid without a cool mascot, right? And in 1991, they found him, Sonic the Hedgehog. He wasn't just a game, he was a whole vibe. His speed, his tude, he was the living embodiment of the Sega brand. And he was the rocket fuel that shot the Genesis to the top. They were even outselling the Super Nintendo for a while in North America. It was huge.
So, at this point, Sega is at the absolute peak of its power, a true giant. But, and this is where the story takes a turn, a series of just baffling decisions and terrible strategic blunders were about to bring the whole empire crashing to its knees.
And it really all started right here, with the Sega Saturn. This thing, it wasn't just a simple mistake. It was the result of what was basically a civil war brewing inside the company. See, Sega of Japan was terrified of the upcoming Sony PlayStation, so they completely ignored the advice from their American team and rushed the Saturn to market with a surprise launch in 1995. It was a disaster. Retailers were angry, and most importantly, developers were alienated because its super complex, dual CPU design was a total nightmare to code for.
And the results? Oh, they were absolutely devastating. Just look at these numbers. The Saturn sold a little over 9 million units. Now compare that to the N64 at almost 33 million, and Sony's PlayStation, which just changed everything, selling over 100 million units. Sega didn't just lose this race, they got lapped multiple times.
Okay, so Sega had one last bullet in the chamber. One last shot. The Dreamcast. It came out in 1999, and honestly, this console was a work of art. It was so innovative, with a built-in modem for online gaming. I mean, who was doing that? It was years ahead of its time. And for a little while, it really, truly felt like Sega was back.
But it just wasn't enough. There was this giant shadow looming over everything, the hype for the upcoming PlayStation 2. It was just too powerful. So even though the Dreamcast had a great start, the sales just started to tank. And then on January 31st, 2001, after just bleeding money for years, Sega dropped the bombshell. They were getting out of the console business. It was over. The dream was dead.
You know, when you look back at their whole hardware journey, you can see the story in 4 acts. It really kicked off with the Master System, right? The Challenger. It sold a respectable 13 million units and put them on the map.
And then came their championship run, the Genesis. This was their peak. Over 30 million units sold, making them a legit global powerhouse.
Then, the disaster. The Saturn. Sales just absolutely cratered, barely scratching 10 million units. The decline was fast, and it was brutal.
And that brings us to the final act, the last stand, the Dreamcast, a console that so many people loved, but it just couldn't stop the bleeding. The sales numbers ended up being almost identical to the Saturn's failure, and that was it, the end of an era. SEGA was officially out of the console game.
But wait, here's where the story gets really interesting. Because leaving the console business, it wasn't the end for SEGA, not by a long shot. In fact, it was a really painful but absolutely necessary new beginning.
Think about it. Once they were free from the insane costs of making hardware, SEGA could go back to what they did best, making amazing games. They leaned hard into their iconic franchises. We're not just talking Sonic, but also the incredible Yakuza series, now called Like a Dragon, and the masterpiece JRPG series Persona, which came along when they bought Atlas. This powerhouse library of games wasn't just how they survived, it was the foundation for a whole new kind of empire.
And that survival has exploded into a massive comeback. I mean, you don't have to look any further than the Sonic the Hedgehog movies. They've made over $1 billion at the box office. If that doesn't prove the lasting power and popularity of SEGA's #1 character, I don't know what does.
And really, that's the Sega we see today. They're not that fallen hardware giant anymore. They're a thriving, super successful modern software company.
What's kind of wild is that today you could argue SEGA is stronger than it's been in decades. Their strategy is brilliant in its simplicity. Take all those amazing games we love and just put them on every single console out there. Yeah, that means on Nintendo and Sony systems too. How crazy is that? They're branching out into theme parks, more movies. They didn't just survive the console wars. You could say they found a way to win the peace that followed. So that leaves us with one last question to chew on. When you look back at SEGA's time making consoles, what's the real takeaway? Is it the story of this brilliant, bold innovator that just flew a little too close to the sun? Or is it more of a tragedy, about a company that just couldn't get out of its own way? It's a legacy that's just as complex and just as fascinating as the games they gave us.